And then let me present. Okay, what we're going to start today is the nervous system. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so we need to talk about nervous tissue and nervous cells. So the nervous system is the master system. It controls and communicates throughout the body. It's the one system in Bio 110 that is probably the most important system. In Bio 114, you'll talk about another important system, and that's the endocrine system. And the two systems really control the body. The cells of the nervous system communicate by electrical and chemical signals very, very rapidly in milliseconds. They usually cause immediate responses. There are three overlapping functions to the nervous system. You need to have a sensory input, something in which information is gathered by receptors about what's happening outside of the body or even inside the body. This is called sensory input. Sensory input is always towards the brain itself, always. Then you have an area called integration. Integration is the area that processes or interprets sensory input, and it usually is the brain itself. And then you have motor output. Motor output is the activation of effector organs, otherwise known as muscles or glands, that produces a response. So you have sensory input, integration, and motor output. You see a glass of water. That is a sensory input. It goes into the brain, and the brain says, I want to drink that water. So it produces a motor output, making your arm and hand grab the water. That is a basic way of talking about the way the nervous system functions. Sensory, integration, and motor output. Okay? There are many functions of the nervous system. And really, there are too many functions, and we're not going to discuss all of them. What I'm going to give you in this, in these three chapters, is I'm going to give you what I think is the most important part of the nervous system and the most important part to remember. The nervous system is divided into two principal parts: the CNS, otherwise known as the central nervous system, and the PNS, otherwise known as the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is in the dorsal body cavity. It consists of the brain and spinal cord. It is basically the integration and control center of your nervous system. It interprets sensory input and it dictates motor output. The peripheral nervous system is a portion of the nervous system that's outside of the CNS. Mostly, it consists of nerves that extend from the brain and the spinal cord. Obviously, spinal cords are from spinal nerves are from the spinal cord, and cranial nerves are from the brain. We will talk about both of them because both of those nerves are extremely important. So here you have the brain and the spinal cord. That is the sensory nervous system. And then you have the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. And those are known as the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has two divisions, and those divisions are sensory and motor. And there are two words that I want you to know: afferent and efferent. The word afferent means sensory. It is always towards the brain itself or towards the spinal cord itself. It is divided into somatic sensory fibers and visceral sensory fibers. Somatic sensory fibers convey impulses from the skin, skeletal muscles, and joints to the central nervous system. The visceral sensory fibers convey impulses from your organs, your stomach, your spleen, your pancreas, to the central nervous system. So somatic and visceral. The motor division is known as efferent. The motor division is always away from the brain or away from the spinal cord. The motor division transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors, which are muscles and glands. Muscles are in the peripheral nervous system, and they are sensory fibers, and glands are in the peripheral nervous system, and they are visceral. So you have motor visceral and motor peripheral. All right? The two divisions of the nervous system are, when you come to the peripheral nervous system, are somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. And we'll touch on that a little bit. The somatic nervous system is the nervous system that conducts nerve fiber impulses from the CNS to the skeletal muscle. Okay? The word soma means body, and most of your body is made of muscles. Okay? It is a voluntary nervous system. You can control it consciously. If you want to have a glass of water or a bottle of water, you pick it up. That's consciousness. The somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is involuntary. You have very little control over it. Okay? You don't tell your stomach when to digest food. You don't tell your heart when to beat. And you don't tell your glands when to produce hormones. It is involuntary. And it consists of visceral motor fibers to the organs. And the autonomic nervous system has two divisions: the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And we'll talk about both of them because they work in opposition to each other. So here you have it. Here's the organization of the nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. It is the integration and control center. It reacts with the peripheral nervous system, which consists of nerves. Nerves that come from the brain are called cranial nerves. Nerves that come from the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. And these communicate between the central nervous system and the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system is divided into the afferent division, sensory, and the motor or efferent division. The afferent division is always conducting impulses towards the brain. The motor division is always conducting nerve fibers away from the brain. The motor division is divided into the somatic, which is the muscles of your body, the skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is involuntary, whereas the somatic system is voluntary. You can control this, you cannot control this. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions. The sympathetic division mobilizes body systems during activity, exercise, fear. If you have a snake in your midst, you're going to run away from it or kill it. Okay? And the parasympathetic division. The parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is the one you have at rest. It is the resting division. Okay? So that's the entire nervous system. Now, the system is controlled by nerves, and those nerves are called neuroglia. Neuroglia are actually glial cells, and these are the small cells that surround and wrap around the primary excitable cells of the nervous system, which are neurons. So glial cells or neuroglia help the nerve cells, and the nerve cells are called neurons. Nerve cells are called neurons. So there are two types of cells in the nervous systems: helper cells and nerve cells. There are four main types of helper cells or neuroglia, and they are astrocytes, microglial cells, epidermal cells, and oligodendrocytes. Let's talk about each one. The most abundant are astrocytes. Does anyone know what the word astro means?
Related
Say
to
it.
Space.
Space? It actually means star. It actually means star. So they're actually star-shaped. They look like stars. And they cling to neurons. They function as a support cell. They are the most abundant neuroglia, and they basically are support cells. Okay? They control the chemical environment around neurons. They participate in information processing in the brain, but they are the most common and the most abundant. And they look like stars. Here is one right here. It looks like a star, many little points, okay? Microglial cells are actually phagocytes. They destroy bacteria. They destroy viruses. They destroy debris. So they are the phagocytes of the nervous system, microglial cells, all right? And this is what they look like. Ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are cells that line the cavities of the brain and the spinal cord. They actually make spinal fluid. They may have cilia on them or hairs, and they move the spinal fluid by beating these little hairs, ependymal cells. They line the central cavities of the brain and the spinal column because that's where the spinal fluid is. So that is their purpose, to make and move spinal fluid. Here they are. They have cilia right here, cilia. They wave it and they move spinal fluid, okay? Oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes basically wrap around the CNS fibers and insulate the nerve fibers. They actually produce myelin, and myelin is white matter. And myelin is like an insulating, it's like putting insulating rubber on a wire so you can insulate it. Okay? So the oligodendrocytes produce myelin sheaths, which is an insulating white matter. And this is what the oligodendrocytes look like. Here they are. Okay? They form the myelin sheaths around nerve fibers. And if anything is insulated, it will conduct electricity better. So these cells are very, very important. In the peripheral nervous system, there are only two neuroglia. And those two neuroglia are satellite cells and Schwann cells. Satellite cells are similar to astrocytes, and they surround the neuron body. Schwann cells are very similar to oligodendrocytes. They also produce myelin. So the Schwann cell of the peripheral nervous system is equal to the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. And they are vital because if a peripheral nerve cell is damaged by a cut or by heat or by radiation, the Schwann cell can regenerate a peripheral nerve. So those are the two cells of the peripheral nervous system. Here is Schwann cells. They are insulators, just like the oligodendrocytes are. They produce myelin. But the most important cell of the nervous system is the neuron. It is the structural unit of the nervous system. It is a large, highly specialized cell that conducts impulses. These cells last forever unless you kill them. And there are certain things that will kill them. They do not divide. They have a high metabolic rate. They require a continuous supply of oxygen and glucose. They have a cell body and one or more processes. Does anyone know what will kill a neuron? What toxic substance will kill a neuron? I will tell you now, it is alcohol. Alcohol will kill neurons. So don't overdrink. The body of the neuron is called the perikaryon or soma. The word soma in Latin means body. Okay? It is the center of the neuron. It contains the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And in the rough endoplasmic reticulum of the neuron, there is chromatin, genetic material. And this is also called Nissl bodies. Also inside of the cell body is a nucleus and a nucleolus. and some of them contain pigments. And this is very important because most neuron cell bodies are located in the central nervous system. The word nuclei is a cluster of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. If you have a cluster of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, it's known as ganglia. Okay? So, and these have very important functions. Very important functions. In the CNS, they're called nuclei. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called ganglia. I'm going to ask you a question on something of this nature. There are processes that come out of the cell itself. Basically, they're arm-like processes. And in the central nervous system, a bundle of these processes are called tracts. If you're in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of neuron processes in the peripheral nervous system is called nerves. And there are two types of processes, either dendrites or axons. And I'll show you the difference. I'll show you the difference, okay? Here we have dendrites. We have dendrites. And on the other side, we have axons. We have axons, okay? Look at the difference. The difference is that the axon is like a tail, and it is insulated. It is insulated, whereas the dendrites are not. They are not. The dendrites are receptive, whereas the axons are impulse generators. Impulse generators. This is the part of the neuron that talks to the other neurons, the axon. That's basically all you have to know about dendrites. You don't really have to know much about dendrites, but this is what they look like. They look like this. They look like this, dendrites, okay? The axon is the most important part of the processes. Each neuron has one axon, and it comes from an area called the hillock, or the axon hillock. And in some neurons, the axons are long, and some of them they're short, and in some of them they're absent. But this is how a cell communicates with another cell in the nervous system, through the axon, okay? At the terminal region of the axon, there is a region that secretes neurotransmitters. And we will talk about neurotransmitters today, because that's probably one of the most important functions of the axon, to produce neurotransmitters. You don't have to know about antegrade and retrograde. That's not important. And you really should know that there are certain viruses that attack the nervous system. And there are 3 of them right here that attack the nervous system: polio, rabies, and herpes simplex. All 3 of these viruses attack the nervous system. So we talked about oligodendrocytes. We talked about Schwann cells, and I told you that both of them produce myelin. What is myelin? Myelin is a white protein fat substance. It insulates the axon. When you have insulation of an axon, it increases the speed of nerve impulse transmission. Myelinated fibers have fast impulses. Non-myelinated fibers have slow impulses. So myelin is very important. And remember, it's produced by Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system and oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. Okay? Here it is. Peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells. They produce it. Just know that. Know that. And here is myelin. It surrounds the axon. It insulates it. And it allows for faster conduction, faster impulses, milliseconds. Okay? Milliseconds. You don't have to know about gaps. That's not important. But you need to know the difference between white matter and gray matter. White matter. There are regions of the brain and spinal cord with dense collections of myelinated fibers. Those myelinated fibers are called fiber tracts, and it is white. And it is white matter. Gray matter has no myelin and is basically neuron cell bodies. Remember, neuron cell bodies, a cluster of them, are either in the brain, and they're called nuclei, or in the peripheral nervous system, and they're called ganglion. So know the difference between white and gray matter. You don't have to know the differences in processes. That's not important. And you have to know the differences between the classifications of neurons, however. Basically, there are three types of neurons. Sensory, and remember what I said about sensory. It's afferent. It transmits impulses to the central nervous system. Motor. It carries impulses away from the central nervous system. These are effectors. These are affectors. Afferent sensory fibers always go towards the central nervous system. Efferent or motor fibers always go away from the nervous system. And then there is a third neuron, the most important neuron. It's called the interneuron, also called association neuron. 99% of your body's neurons are interneurons. They shuttle signals inside of the brain, inside of the CNS. They lie between motor and sensory neurons. Any questions on that type of neurons or cells? We're going to now talk about the fundamentals, and then we'll be through with chapter 11, okay? The nervous system works by a connection from neuron to neuron. The connection from neuron to neuron is known as a synapse. You either connect from one neuron to the next, or you connect from one neuron to an effector cell. That effector cell can be on a muscle. That effector cell can be on a gland. But this is how information is transferred in the nervous system. There is a presynaptic neuron which sends the information, and there is a postsynaptic neuron which receives the information. The presynaptic neuron conducts the impulses towards the synapse. The postsynaptic neuron receives the information from the synapse. The only words on this slide you have to know are the bottom two words. There are two types of synapses, chemical and electrical. Chemical synapses are the most common type. There is a specialized release and a reception of a chemical, and that chemical is called a neurotransmitter. It is typically composed of two parts. The axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron contains vesicles filled with neurotransmitter. It's in bags. The receptor region on the postsynaptic neuron receives the neurotransmitter. The two parts, the terminal and the receptor area, are separated by a cleft, and that cleft is filled with fluid and is known as the synaptic cleft. An electrical impulse is changed to a chemical across the synapse where the neurotransmitter is, and then back to an electrical impulse. So you go from an electrical impulse to a chemical impulse to an electrical impulse. So what is transmission like across this fluid-filled cleft? The cleft prevents nerve impulses from directly passing from one neuron to another. You need to have a chemical involved. Electrical to chemical to electrical. And it depends on the release of the neurotransmitter, the diffusion of the neurotransmitter, and the binding of the transmitter. Usually, this ensures that the transmission between neurons is in one direction, unidirectional. So let's go through a synapse. The action potential arrives, this is electricity. The electricity arrives at the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron. Calcium is involved. Without calcium, there is no nerve transmission. The calcium channels open. Calcium enters the axon terminal. Calcium flows down the electrochemical gradient outside of the cell into the axon terminal. Here it is. This is where the axon meets the synaptic cleft, right here. And calcium is involved. Calcium entry causes the bags of the synaptic vesicles to release the neurotransmitter. Calcium causes this protein, you don't have to know this protein, to react with other proteins that controls the fusion of the vesicles with the axon membrane. When fusion results, In exocytosis, now the bag breaks. The bag breaks, and the neurotransmitter now goes into the synaptic cleft. The higher the impulse frequency, the more vessels break, leading to a greater effect. The neurotransmitter diffuses across the cleft and binds to receptors in the postsynaptic neuron. The binding of the neurotransmitter opens ion channels, creating electricity. So you go from electricity to chemical to electricity, and that is how an impulse is carried in the central nervous system through a chemical synapse using a neurotransmitter. And then the neurotransmitter effects are terminated. The majority of termination of the neurotransmitter is degradation by an enzyme. And for every neurotransmitter, there is an enzyme that will degrade it. And the electricity stops. Remember, this happens in milliseconds. In milliseconds. Synaptic delay is not important. Electrical impulses are less common, and I'm not even going to talk about them because 99% of all synapses in your brain and in your body are chemical synapses. They all use neurotransmitters. So let's talk about neurotransmitters. I want you to know some neurotransmitters. The big one and the most understood is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is used by the autonomic nervous system. So it's used at rest. It's also used when you are frightened, when you are cold. It is synthesized from acetic acid and choline and is degraded by the most important enzyme in your body, and that is acetylcholinesterase. Acetylcholinesterase. This stops the reaction. Here it is. This stops the reaction. Acetylcholinesterase degrades acetylcholine so that the reaction stops. The other neurotransmitters have also been studied, and they are divided into catecholamines and indolamines. I want you to know dopamine. I want you to know norepinephrine. And I want you to know epinephrine. And they're made from an amino acid called tyrosine. The indolamines, basically serotonin, that's the one I want you to know, is made from the amino acid tryptophan. So no dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, and no, they're made from tyrosine, and no serotonin, which is made from tryptophan. These are extremely important catecholamines and indolamines. Some of them, imbalances, affect your mental health. They all affect your emotions. They all affect your biological clock. Also, some of your neurotransmitters are amino acids. And the one I want you to remember is right here, GABA. gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, okay? This is a proven neurotransmitter, a very important one, a very important one. The only other one I want you to remember is endorphin. Endorphin. And the reason I want you to remember endorphin is because it is a neurotransmitter that reduces pain perception and is very commonly produced in athletes, athletes that run marathons. The ability to run a marathon is the basis of endorphins. After you go about 10 miles, your body is in pain. But because of endorphins, it allows you to continue that race because it reduces pain perception. Endorphin. Okay? Purines are not important. The gases are not important. Another one is endocannabinoids. Yeah, this is the active ingredient in marijuana. THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. It is synthesized in your body and is believed to be involved in learning and memory. So, endocannabinoids, another neurotransmitter that I want you to remember. You don't have to know the effects. That's not really important and is very loosely described. And that is it. Let me get off of recording.